Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, the newest podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. I am Cody, one of the co-hosts here, and this is our Chapter 1 of Crying of Lot 49 episode, wherein we will dive into this book.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
All right, so Will, do you want to give us a little bit of kind of an explanation of the first chapter, I guess kind of the book in general, but really the first chapter, just kind of a breakdown of what we got here?
Well, so I'm not really prepared to break down the whole book, but Crying of Lot 49 is really about paranoia and conspiracies and how that interlaces into the rest of society. And in particular, it's about how we as individuals can operate in systems as large as modern nation states and economies. This chapter in particular opens as Oedipa Maas, a Southern California housewife, back home from a Tupperware party, opens a letter from an LA law firm to learn that her real estate mogul ex-boyfriend named Pierce Inverarity had died the previous spring and named her as co-executor of his estate. This confuses her, and so she racks her memory for any possible cause for this decision, and she goes about her daily duties while doing so. At the end of the day, her efforts only unearth a prank call that Pierce had made to her at 3 a.m. the previous year. The conversation consisted of a series of ridiculous ethnic caricatures ending in a Lamont Cranston impersonation of all people, and a vague in-character threat against Mucho, real name Wendell, Oedipa's husband, who'd suggested hanging up. When Mucho returns from his job DJing at the KCUF pop station, he complains about his lack of faith in the work, and Oedipa calls him sensitive, knowing his history as a former antithetical used car salesman. The lot had been his proverbial Korea. He, years ago, had vacated that position because of the emotional wear and tear of shuffling everyday families from dented rust bucket to jalopy and back, and he still shudders at reminders of that manipulative business. And she muses if it wouldn't have been easier for the both of them if Korea hadn't been his Korea. He continues, sharing that the program director has, for the umpteenth time, criticized his flirtation with teenage callers on air. Finally, Oedipa shares the contents of the letter with him. Mucho suggests she speak to their lawyer and assures her that he has no doubts of her fidelity to him. That night, in an echo of Pierce's phone call, Oedipa's therapist, Dr. Hilarius, rings, demanding that she trust him, to take the drugs he's prescribed her, and to join his psychedelics trial, Die Brücke. Already hallucinating the image of a pointing Uncle Sam, she declines all three offers. The call terminates, and the image shifts to one of Hilarius pulling some sort of face that he believes to be therapeutic, and it stays with her as she lies awake until dawn. In the next morning, she visits her lawyer, named Roseman, who was up late himself last night, working on a draft of an indictment of Perry Mason, for whom he holds a deep theoretical respect but personal hatred for. Some comedy of manners begins their meeting, then they go to lunch, where he tries to engage her in some footsie before proposing an elopement. Oedipa declines. Finishing the meeting, he advises her of the general responsibilities of an executrix and offers assistance. He also recommends curiosity. Taking his lead, the narrator foreshadows great revelations for our heroine, who is situated as a Rapunzel. Flashback to a vacation she took with Inverarity to Mexico City. They're at a Remedios Varo exhibition, and Oedipa silently weeps while studying the central piece of Bordando el Manto Terrestre, which features young waifs at work in a tower of their own, all embroidering tapestry which falls out of the windows and makes up the rest of the triptych. She asked then why she felt like a trapped damsel, why Pierce couldn't free her, whether the tower was real, and if it mattered either way. She wished she could carry that with her forever. And
man, just listening to that recap makes me remember. I just read this a couple days ago, but it reminds me of just how funny this book can be. And all of his work, but just, so many parts of it are just greatly absurd and funny and weird at the same time. So I think I kind of want to just go over everyone's thoughts on this chapter, as far as I know we've all read this book before, but what is your general impression like as far as it setting up the story? Because we all know how things unfold later on, but do you feel like it does a good job of bringing us into what's going to happen in this story?
I do think it's a good introduction. Like you said, the absurdity. I think especially I found like the Uncle Sam description it's, like very visceral, and that seems to be kind of like it's kind of a caricature of America. And I mean you could view this whole book as a kind of a caricature of California culture, which this maybe doesn't even need to be said, but in the 60s, California was viewed as a type of like maybe like I mean, I think hippies viewed California as a type of utopia, and I do think that um type of view of California still kind of persists for some people. I mean, it's maybe more turned into like Hollywood stuff and wanting to be famous. I actually haven't seen La La Land, but that kind of stuff. You get what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's that kind of, I don't want to use the term promised land, but it holds, I think, a significance for a lot of people in different ways. Um, so yeah, I think you're spot on there because it does have that kind of, especially if you're looking at it from the hippie, counterculture of the '60s and early '70s, as compared to now, and the kind of duality between that and how Hollywood operates now as a business. Will, what did you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think central to the book is that image of California as the place where stuff happens. And in particular, this chapter, I think, does a really good job of setting us up to have a tangible sense of the psychedelic approach to time and connection that the rest of the book handles, while still situating us perfectly in the comfortable suburban world of a housewife who tends to her herb garden and a workaday husband who, you know, is kind of weak-willed but can rely on his wife to support him.
Yeah, I do think with the parody stuff, especially, it does seem to be like Pynchon does seem to be wanting the reader to focus on Oedipa as a housewife, a suburban housewife. Um, I can't remember if it's in this chapter especially, but just in general in this book, her boredom with her life, her lack of satisfaction with her life, which she doesn't. She seems to kind of increasingly be coming to terms with over the course of the book. But this first chapter seems to really hit home that she's kind of just some housewife who kind of randomly chose a husband whenever it was time to settle down. Maybe is not super intentional with how she lives her life. Um, is kind of just floating through life until she gets this phone call about, or she gets the letter about being executrix of the uh of the will or whatever. And speaking of that, my kind of little pet theory here, which I think kind of applies to the section we're on, is that I mean I don't putting yourself in Oedipa's place, like getting a letter where you are named the executor or executrix of your ex romantic partner's will. It does seem to be kind of maybe a bit. It struck me as kind of wish fulfillment. Like you break up with someone, you're not really sure, what that relationship meant to the other person. Like were you the love of their life? Do they miss you? All this stuff. But that does seem to be kind of confirmation for Oedipa that she did mean something to Pierce, and especially with the flashback near the end of the chapter, it's obvious that Pierce had a pretty big influence on Oedipa in a lot of ways. It's never exactly stated why they broke up, I think, or what happened, or why they didn't get married, why she chose Mucho over Pierce, if that was actually what happened. But I don't know, just putting myself in Oedipa's place, like if I was named executor of my ex-girlfriend's will, it would confirm to me that we actually had a connection and that connection was special to that person. And I don't know, I could kind of go off about like Pynchon and romance. I have some kind of half-formed thoughts about Gravity's Rainbow and like the Jessica, I think it's Roger Mexico romance. Where like Pynchon does address romance, I think, a lot more than people give him credit for, and a lot of that is pretty heartfelt. I know that, I mean, I don't. Pynchon seems like Pynchon. Like one of the reasons people think that one of the reasons Pynchon doesn't like pictures of himself is because of his teeth. Pynchon seems to be known as like for like rumors and gossip to be perhaps somewhat insecure in his physical appearance. Assuming that is kind of, I don't really like assuming that because it's obviously never been confirmed. And that's basically just based off of ramblings on the subreddit and just kind of general rumors. But I did find it really interesting that, like in looking at it as wish fulfillment.
I see where you're going with it, and to kind of touch on the Oedipa and Mucho relationship thing. I think it's interesting because I think that there is I think they genuinely care for each other, but I think it's kind of like, as you mentioned, they kind of just were both looking for someone to be with, Oedipa after Pierce and Mucho after whatever he was doing before then. But I think they're also, I think kind of what's really established here in the first chapter is how connected to the past each of them is for different reasons. Mucho can't really let go of the car lot that he had and the experiences he had there. And, and especially in the first chapter, we come back to it a lot in his experiences there. And then with Oedipa, where it's kind of more important because obviously she's the central character here. She has that need for meaning from her relationship with Pierce. And I think it's exactly as you said, where, getting that letter that she's the executrix of his estate, like that's a weird thing to get for what is essentially like an ex-boyfriend, a year after the last time you even just talked to them. But I think for Oedipa, it fulfills that kind of need to know that she was important to him, even if she's not catching what's going on. And I don't want to touch too much on how things develop further down, but I think that for her, definitely getting that kind of gratification of just knowing like, yes, I was important enough to him to be made the executrix of his estate is vital for her.
I think that's definitely the case. I think kind of tying into what you were saying, Luke, about the people thinking Pynchon doesn't talk about romance. I think what more people say actually is, he doesn't talk about people. And I think that this first chapter is kind of the antithesis of that. Every single joke, every single wry line, every single weird surrealist kazoo orchestra in this chapter can be interpreted as a reflection of how Oedipa is perceiving the world around her. And to that, to a larger extent, I don't want to get too deep into the rest of the book, but there's a very sophomoric reading, you could say, that this is a very large metaphor for dealing with the grief of the love of your life. You can sit here and reinterpret every crazy thing that happens from here on out as somebody just struggling to find themselves after the loss of someone they really love and really care about. And I don't think anything sets that up better than really the last paragraph of this chapter, where she talks about how, where Pynchon talks about how she doesn't necessarily see herself as Rapunzel, but how, in a sense, she was Rapunzel, and that Pierce has found his way up to her and found himself with her in some way that wasn't entirely straightforward, wasn't entirely genuine, but one that was still real to her, even if staring at that painting, she still feels like she's trapped, isolated somehow.
Yeah, and I mean, I think kind of like the flip side of what I'm talking about, which is more borne out through the rest of the book, and I don't necessarily want to get into it too much, but there's I personally, I mean, you can either view her being named executrix of the estate as confirmation that she meant something, or it could just be Pierce is still mad that they broke up, and Pierce is looking for a way to mess with her, which is not. I mean, it's in the first chapter too, because I mean, he calls her in the middle of the night, does a bunch of voices, and notably, he never does his own voice. He's never himself. He's playing characters as other people. Um, which I mean, usually when somebody's doing an impression and you know them, you can tell from their voice that they're who it is. But um, it could either mean like she was the love of his life, and he wants her to know that she was important, or it's just an opportunity for him to continue messing with her, messing with her head. And I don't know. I mean, we can probably. This is basically taken from the subreddit, but I have heard rumors that the scene where a woman gets a nose job in V is supposedly a bit of a fuck you to one of Pynchon's ex-girlfriends from college, who ended up marrying someone else. I don't know. You can view it either way, and I think that is kind of indicative of the book at large, where yeah, I don't necessarily want to get into it too much because we're just on chapter 1, but um, it's on like you can come up with a bunch of different interpretations from this book and even from the first chapter. And I do think like even on the first page um of my copy, like whenever she goes over her memories of Pierce, the first memory is like the ending of their relationship, where the hotel room, the door had just been slammed. It seemed forever. Like the final, what she thought at the time was the final ending, but then that's followed by a description, kind of vague description of a sunrise at Cornell University. Um, and then it gets into, that's kind of more of I would assume that's a happy memory. I mean, generally my memories of sunrises are happy, although staying up all night and seeing the sunrise can sometimes be a bad thing, I guess. And then there's a description of a dry, disconsolate tune from the fourth movement of the concerto, which seems to seems to be like more of a sad thing. And then one of the other reasons I brought that up, the whole like the dichotomy between either she meant a lot to him or it's just him messing with her, is the mention of Jay Gould, who I looked this up online. I think it was the Pynchon wiki, and then I have a book. I forget who by, but it's like a more in-depth version of the Pynchon wiki where they go through the references. But Jay Gould was apparently kind of a robber baron who is known as a bad person, which maybe isn't that big of a deal, but the fact that Pierce has a statue, like a bust of his face, speaks to the fact that Pierce could have looked up to Jay Gould and wanted to be like him, which kind of would give the reader the impression, perhaps, that Pierce is one of those, rich, I'm blanking on the word here, rich asshole, I guess.
No, I think absolutely. I don't think someone's going to have a bust of someone in their house that they don't like. I think that if you're investing that kind of capital into something like that, you probably in some way, shape, or form admire that person. So I think that speaks a lot to him. I'm sorry, Will, you were going to say something?
I was just going to basically say the same thing. I think it's really hard to overlook. We've all read most of or all of Pynchon's other published novels, and a recurring character is the millionaire asshole. And I think him situating Jay Gould, he's kind of like the shittier version of J.P. Morgan or any of those other Gilded Age robber baron types.
Yeah.
He's just he didn't achieve anything other than making himself wealthy and pissing off a lot of people. And I think that's a very meaningful thing to look at here, especially when, for me, that section of, she thought of a hotel room in Mazatlan and the dry, disconsolate tune from the fourth move into the Bartok Concerto for Orchestra. For me, that section feels like Oedipa's memory of Pierce, and to me, that reads as he is dry. He looks up to the past, but not any spiritual, meaningful part of the past. Just an asshole who got rich. He listens to music, but it's not, super moving. They watched a sunrise that they couldn't even see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Pierce is, for a character who's, dead at the start of the book, is a fascinating character, and seeing him via flashback, I think is an interesting way of kind of getting to know his character. Something I wanted to touch on, I don't remember which of y'all had mentioned it earlier, but about Pynchon's, just the way he writes people. Something that really struck me when I was rereading this was on my edition. And I mean, we should probably mention which editions we're using, because there's so many of these for Lot 49. I have the Harper Perennial Modern Classic. I think it's kind of one of the more common copies. On page 4, kind of our introduction to Mucho, where Oedipa's talking about how he's overly sensitive, and how he walked out of a party one night because someone used the word cream puff. It seemed maliciously. That one, I had to look that up. And for anyone who's new to Pynchon, I'm just gonna say this right now. You're gonna look stuff up. I think that's part of what I love about reading his work, is that I'm constantly having to jump onto either the Pynchon wiki, which, again, if you're new or if you just haven't even heard of it, you need to bookmark that page, because it is invaluable as a resource for understanding a lot of the pop cultural, scientific, mathematical references that are prevalent in his books, and they are super prevalent and very interesting to learn about. Cream puff, I did not understand the context of that initially. And I don't know if either of you were familiar with it. It actually refers to a used car that's in unusually good condition. Which I think is important for the next paragraph, because that's when we get this, like, really what I would describe as the first real Pynchon-esque part of this book, the long paragraph that's almost a single sentence, where he's talking about Mucho's, the things that he saw at the car lot, the people coming in that were trading in cars, and how their cars that they were bringing in were kind of a reflection of them as a person. I'm not going to read it because it's insanely long, and I don't want to bog down what we're doing here with this page and a half really of text. But to me, it was such a beautiful way of writing this idea that really a lot of other authors would have just kind of condensed into, like, he remembered seeing people bring in cars, and they would trade them in, and blah blah blah. But he takes the time to lay out how, these people, Mucho was seeing them as people, and Pynchon's presenting them to us as people who are really only in this part of the book, but they're still given this humanity of understanding who they are through how they lived. And I think that's just a fascinating thing. And I think that kind of speaks to that earlier point of Pynchon writing people.
Yeah, and this is kind of an aside, but one thing I found interesting was that Mucho cries over the car lot, and so therefore we get more like the crying of the lot, and this doesn't have anything to do with 49, but I do think it's kind of interesting that, without giving away the ending, I guess, but the first chapter does feature crying as it relates to a lot, like a literal lot, not a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say, for anyone who's new to Pynchon, which probably not too many of you out there who are listening to this, but in case you are, he puts a lot of red herrings everywhere, on a thematic level, on a plot level, on a character level. he will trick the reader intentionally. And I find his use of crying throughout this book to be just kind of the epitome of that. Because yeah, Mucho is crying over a lot. Not too. It's really on the nose, and it's really ridiculous. Because obviously, yes, it is sad that like anyone can sit and think about the economic exploitation of the impoverished in America, and especially how that intersects with property and real estate, including cars, and feel bad for the everyday person. But at the same time, you wouldn't work at a car lot and sob over literally skin cells, because that's not the important part. But for Mucho, it is.
Yeah,
And it drives home how much Pynchon really values the little guy.
Something I wanted to bring up and see what you guys thought. In the notes that I took on this first chapter, obviously there's the reference to the phone call that Oedipa got a year ago from Pierce, where he's doing all the impressions and the caricatures and never really speaking in his own voice. But then a little bit later on, I don't remember the exact page, but when she is talking with Dr. Hilarius, and I love that name. That's another thing, is I love Pynchon's naming is just so spot on, and I love every part of it. But when he calls her, it specifically says that he sounds like one of Pierce's Gestapo voices. And so that made me kind of stop and think, like, well, given what we know of how things progress, like, is there a chance that Hilarius was there with Pierce, and that this was more than one person, and that maybe he's in on whatever Pierce is doing to kind of harass Oedipa, if that's what he's doing, or if he's just there in the background to kind of because his role in Oedipa's life, and kind of wanting to understand the facets of her, is he doing it to get an understanding of how the dynamic is between them, if he's even there? It just could be that it was just a weird coincidence.
Well, it's definitely true that it's possible that Hilarius was set up to be Oedipa's psychiatrist by Pierce in some sense, to do very mild spoilers. That's true about everything in her life.
Yeah, that actually didn't occur to me, but that's a really interesting thing to think about. It would kind of speak to like how vast the conspiracy could be, and how basically omnipotent and omnipresent Pierce can seem at times in this novel.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think there's any real reason to believe that that Hilarius was on the phone call from Pierce, but I do think you're definitely supposed to think about that. You're definitely supposed to see that connection.
And this kind of brings me, I'm going through my notes, and one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on, and again, for new readers, I think it's important to note that Pynchon has a very, I don't know, the interesting sense of humor, much in line with how I kind of see things and find what's humorous. I think he has a very sort of anarchic / dad joke kind of humor that merges these weird things that are, sometimes they're just like awful puns, and sometimes it's really highbrow comedy, that exists, in the same page sometimes. Something like, for me, that had me like, I just laugh out loud every time I read it, is when Oedipa first goes to meet up with Roseman and tells her, "Hey, I have to execute a will," and he's like, "Oh, well, don't let me stop you." And just like stupid things like that. It's just so, it's such a dad joke level of humor, but it's so goddamn funny at the same time.
Yeah, his sense of humor seems, especially over the course of his the rest of his books, it seems somewhat all inclusive. Like there doesn't seem to be, there's slapstick humor, there's crass humor, there's puns. I mean, I'm not an expert on comedy, but I can't really think of a type of comedy he doesn't at some point or another reference or include.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, there's Marx Brothers, elements of it, and at times actual Marx Brothers. There's, it's got a Monty Python sort of level of weird at times, and then it's just, it's all over the place, and it's part of what I love. Also, and then I think it was Will that mentioned earlier in the summary, about his Roseman's wanting to take down Perry Mason because he can't be Perry Mason. He wants to basically just destroy this fictional character. And I love that part.
Well, and I really love that part in particular because it's kind of a foreshadowing of a theme that Pynchon had talked about before this book and is prevalent in every book afterwards. But in this one, it takes a very, very much a back seat, though it's still present. And that is the fact that men just kind of self-destruct when they feel sexually inadequate. That's really what that's about. Is, you know, his wife watches Perry Mason and loves Perry Mason, and he looks at Perry Mason as like the ideal of who a lawyer could be, and for him that's not okay. He can't handle that, and that's ridiculous. Again, that's very silly.
It is, yeah, especially, yeah. I mean, just that whole concept of like, well, if you know, if I can't be that, then I'll just take that. I'll just get rid of that, you know, however I can. If that involves crafting this bizarre lawsuit, whatever he's trying to do to bring Perry Mason down. Yeah, I love that part.
So I did have a question going back a bit, back to Mucho's pseudo PTSD. What do y'all take from the last sentence there of endless convoluted incest? How is it incest? Because I can think of a few reasons, but I'm not strong. I don't feel strongly.
Okay, you're talking about at the end of that long description of the okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the okay, so to Mucho it was horrible, endless convoluted incest. I'm not really sure. I didn't really think about how that made me feel at that time. I think I was kind of lost in the prose that existed before that.
I mean, I think, is that the first mention of like kind of deviant sexuality in this book? I mean, I think it's on the next page for me. We get the Mucho Maas quote about how he hits on teenage girls.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what I interpreted the endless convoluted incest, if I really thought about it at all, was that I don't, maybe I'm looking at the paragraph now. I'm not really finding justification, but it could just be that it's like people come in with cars and then they sell the car and they get another one and then they come back and sell that car, and then, you know, it's like this like it's creating this like a circle of buy a car from a used car lot, sell the car back to the used car lot and buy a different car, and then sell that car back to the used car lot and buy a different car, which would then create like a closed loop, a closed community. And so that would maybe be like a metaphor for, or the incest would then be a metaphor for that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in having a minute to kind of think on it, I think if we pull out a little bit of it and see it as more of just people who are closely related, I think all of those people that are being described in that that particular scene, there is a common thread, that kind of, you know, working class, lower class person that's being described, because, you know, a used car that comes in, you know, in good condition, a cream puff, isn't going to come from one of those people. And so I think it's just that kind of, you know, like Luke was just saying, that cyclical nature of, you know, the same thing over and over, because those people cannot typically get out of that situation. So it's just, you know, trading one bad thing in for another thing that's just almost better, but it's not going to be better for long. And then you're just, you know, back to where you were again, over and over and over.
Yeah, and I do one thing that does go on in this first chapter is I do think there are some references to how degrading capitalism can be. There's on page 4 for me, there's the mention of he was a disc jockey who worked ... and then he says he suffered regular crises of conscience about his profession. I don't believe in any of it, Ed. He could usually get out. I try, I truly can't. And it talks about how like his emotions concerning that are pretty much unreachable because they're so deep inside of him. And, as someone, I do have a master's degree, but my last job was pizza delivery. I've worked some jobs that I feel like, were kind of perhaps below me, but you have to make money to live in this society. I think a lot of people do find their jobs somewhat degrading or somewhat below them, but they have to do it anyway. I do think that comes up some here, and I do think Oedipa perhaps comes to see her being a housewife, who a suburban housewife who doesn't have a lot of she has time to go to Tupperware parties and get drunk, and that seems to be like a pretty big event for her. Like her life isn't super exciting. um I don't know, I mean, it seems to be kind of um I think this book is set in 1963, is that correct?
Some
I
people
think
say
so.
64, but I came to 63.
Yes, that would have been around the time of the Kennedy assassination, which is another thing that we can probably get into later in the book. Which I know some people view the entire book as a commentary on the Kennedy assassination and its aftermath. But 63, 64 would have been the beginning, if I'm correct. I think I'm correct. Would have been kind of the beginnings of the hippie movement. And a big part of the
Mhm.
hippie movement is people feeling like the way things were going and like what they were doing, it's drop out, or what was it, tune in, drop
Tune
out, turn
in.
on, or something.
Yeah, the
Y-
Leary, Tim and Leary. Yeah.
like leave
Turn
your life,
on,
start.
tune in, drop out.
Yeah, like leave your life, start doing drugs, and start sitting around smoking weed and talking about the universe or something. Like it was a time of people becoming dissatisfied with the way things were, um, which is definitely present in this book.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and specifically that kind of message, I think this chapter is of a sort of metaphor for that, where it starts in very tame world. The book, I suppose, starts in a very tame world and then spirals out into absolute psychosis. It really is kind of a recapitulation of Pynchon repeatedly agreeing with people like Timothy Leary in principle, but not at all in execution, where he does want people to, expand their mind, maybe not through drugs, but, challenge themselves and see things from a different perspective. And he does want people to drop out of society and build their own. But he just doesn't believe that any of the movements have done that.
Yeah, and I
Well,
mean, I did interpret the part about Hilarius's drug drug experiment. I wrote down MK Ultra in the margin, um, which is something that like the dark side of the hippie movement is something that's gotten into an inherent vice in Vineland.
yep.
Um, and I mean, it's kind of amazing that that's even in here and that you can even write MK Ultra in the margins, because that would have been well before it was ever reported on. I don't think it was reported on until the late 70s, I want to say, in the New York Times. Um, but yeah, I mean, Pynchon seems already to be aware of the dark side of the hippie movement even while it was going on, and seemed a lot of other people, it took until the mid to late 70s for them to realize how the supposedly utopic nature of the hippie movement has actually had a pretty severe dark side to it.
Yeah, a lot of the time when people talk about how Pynchon is a central figure of counterculture, in the post 70s era, they think of him as a hippie, and he's not. He's about the same age as Hunter S. Thompson. From a generational standpoint, he's much more of a beat than he is a hippie.
Yeah, I would
Mhm.
agree with that. And even his prose style, especially in V, I would say is you can tell that he's read some Kerouac. And then
Oh
I think
yeah.
cited.
Gravity's Dreamboat, you can tell he's read some Burroughs. So
Oh, in this book, in Crying of Lot 49, the scene where Oedipa drives into San Narciso, it's practically stolen from On the Road driving into San Francisco, I think.
I was gonna say I know that I don't know if it's on record, quote unquote, but I know that On the Road has been cited as a huge influence on him. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that would sneak its way.
Yeah,
In
I
there.
just read On the Road myself, and it absolutely cemented for me the opinion that for at least Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon was doing a lot of speed.
He was
I would-
definitely,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, he was definitely on something. I'm of the opinion that he was taking acid whenever he was writing Gravity's Rainbow, but of course, we'll never know.
I
it's
think
yeah. I don't. There's
I
no
think
way we could never know.
he's gone on record saying that cannabis was a main thing, and
Yeah,
Yeah,
people around
there's
him have said that he used a lot of amphetamines.
yeah,
Yeah.
there is that it's like there's some article I think from the early 70s that it's like some guy I forget what the title is. The title is
I
something like
literally just read this the other day. I think I know exactly what
yeah,
you're
it's
talking
like
about. Where he
I
smoked
hung out
weed
with
with
Thomas.
Pynchon.
Yeah, I smoked weed
Yep.
with Thomas Pynchon, and it describes him just sitting there hanging out with people and just rolling joint after joint after joint and smoking joint after joint after joint and seemingly the weed having no effect upon him.
Right. But it
Um,
also, I think he also mentioned that he didn't talk much. He just listened. And I think that's really interesting because I think that kind of keys into how he might be as a writer, that he's taking in so much of the world and then, just letting it all out. And obviously we can't say for sure how he writes, what his process is, what he uses and doesn't use. But I definitely would not be surprised if there was some sort of, you know, maybe he felt a need to, because of all the information that was within him, like maybe LSD or marijuana or whatever it is, was like having that was what let him get it all out. Because yeah, Gravity's Rainbow has that rambling, like I just took a whole bunch of acid and here's all my thoughts at once kind of vibe.
I just, I don't, I'm not of the opinion that he was writing on LSD. Obviously the guy took some psychedelics, but to me, his books don't read that way to me. They read much more as stoned and slippery than they do as hyper connected.
yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, this is kind of more of a general comment, and I saw it. I think it wasn't on the Pynchon subreddit, but it was somewhere on Reddit that was talking about how like I would say like well over half of the books that are considered classics the from the 60s onwards in the 20th century kind of assume that the reader has um you know like been in experienced some type of hallucinogen in their time. I mean, marijuana is technically, I think, a mild hallucinogen, and I think you all get what I'm saying. Or like, it's just kind of assumed with a lot of books that you at least have accessed that head state at least once.
Well, I actually I saw that thread. I'm not sure it was on the Thomas Pynchon subreddit. I think it was on the literature subreddit.
I think you're right. Yeah.
I disagree. Not necessarily in terms of what the authors were thinking or whatever, because psychedelia absolutely broke into pop and high culture at that time period. But I think it's more useful to think of it less as expecting the reader to have experience with psychedelic experience, and more expecting the reader to be used to having to interface with those kinds of things. And it's a subtle
Yeah.
difference.
That's
but
fair. Yeah.
And I
think
mean,
it
I
can come from like meditation rather than actually drug use.
that's a good point. And I mean, one
Yeah.
thing, this is kind of random, but I get on the website The Ringer a lot, the Bill Simmons
I do too.
website.
Yep.
Yeah, and they did a thing on not pop Doctor Strange a while ago where they talked about like the 60s 70s run of Doctor Strange and how psychedelic it was, and how like the person who did the art for it, and they had examples of the art, and it's very like like LSD vision type stuff, but how the person who did the art for that had never was basically like a teetotaler. I get what you're saying, where you don't necessarily have to
Yeah.
have smoked weed or done a bunch of acid to know what that kind of stuff entails.
That's a good point because I should have backtracked on that a little bit because I've spent the last week listening to Frank Zappa and he's a prime example of that someone can be so just creative and looked at from the outside as like a weird person who they had to have done some kind of drugs to make what they made. But Zappa was notoriously anti-drug to the point where anyone in his band was not allowed to be using drugs. And he still like his output was insane. So yeah, I think that's fair, but we'll obviously never know with Pynchon specifically, what his approach was.
Yeah, and I think in particular, I mean, regardless of whether you have to have done acid to understand what books that were written with that in mind, uh, I mean, so there's a thing. I don't know if either of you are at all plugged into the modern hippie psychedelic culture at all, but there is a phrase, and it's that psychedelics turn your mind into the world, as in that everything you see, everything you hear, everything you experience and think about gets integrated into your perception in every other way too. And I think that really links into the choice of Bordando el Manto Terrestre as the central illusion of the novel, because it is, you know, it's a bunch of girls with very emotional faces staring out into a landscape which they've all created, that they are making.
Right. And being, I think there's some importance to if I'm not mistaken, there's like a character in the center of that painting that's kind of overlooking everything and keeping an eye on them.
Yeah, there's a taskmaster of sorts.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, yeah, I think, and especially and we kind of touched on it with the California trilogy of Lot 49 and Vineland and Inherent Vice, there is that exploration of the potential of the hippie movement and what it could have been had it not been for the external elements of, you know, I think that the Kennedy assassination, I think, kind of moved everything, shifted the zeitgeist into what happened. But there's the combination of, you know, in the 80s, you know, with Reaganomics and all that, and the rise of late end capitalism, that was really, really integral in bringing down the counterculture movement. But the counterculture movement also did a lot of damage to themselves. And I think that's a lot of what Pynchon gets at times, especially in this book, but I think a lot more so it's explored in Vineland.
Yeah, and like COINTELPRO, I think it was called, where like, you know, like using and I think that's maybe more has to do with like Black Panthers and stuff, but using, you know, people inside the movement to make the movement look bad was definitely a thing.
Yeah, it's very tricky to look back on it historically, because you have people like Charles Manson who were in some ways a hybrid of, you know, the powers that be controlling the counterculture, and a genuine case of just somebody doing a ton of drugs and going off their rocker. And then on the other side, you have people like Timothy Leary, who were more or less, you know, had the best intentions the whole time, really didn't do that much wrong per se, but still didn't make anything of it. And then you have people like, I think he went by Dr. Acid in the early 60s, hanging out in the San Francisco area, where he was running around constantly doing meth, constantly giving people massive doses of intravenous LSD, but also incredibly like direct action focused as a person, trying to keep people safe, and yet at the same time, you know, being a meth head, not achieving anything.
Well, that happened. I spent a lot of high school, and I still go back to it every now and then. I had this fascination with counterculture movement, and especially with the Yippie movement, like Abby Hoffman and Bobby Seale and those guys. And I still have a few of Abby Hoffman's books. Abby Hoffman was like a huge influence to me, especially in high school, like that kind of anarchic, wanting to bring down capitalism and make society better. But kind of like you mentioned, like he kind of self-imploded because of drugs. He got, you know, there's debate on how things went down, but he ended up getting, you know, involved in a cocaine bust that ultimately led to him developing an addiction and then taking his own life. But you know, he was so integral in a lot of the let's make everything free, or you know, we don't need to focus so much on, you know, making money and having that be the goal of life. But then he was ultimately brought down by, you know, depending on how you look at it, you know, either the government had a hand in it, or he just lost his own way. And I think he sits somewhere in the middle of that, between the Manson and Leary thing, where, you know, there's the bad people doing bad things for bad reasons or selfish reasons, and the good guys who had the right intentions, but for whatever reason, it just they couldn't ever get anything off the ground. I kind of feel like Pierce is the back end of that kind of, he's, his focus was success and being the capitalist man. And so, and I think that's also explored later, again in Vineland and in Inherent Vice, but that guy who's working to bring people like Mucho and some of those other, I wouldn't say Mucho's too much counterculture, but the guy who's just trying to be out there for himself, and the people that brought cars into his lot are the ones that are affected by that. So
yeah, I think the role of the hippie movement and psychedelics in particular in this book is one of the most confusing parts. We'll get to it later, but the way that it's discussed in this book is very out of place compared to the rest of the novels of his, with the exception of its association with, as you name dropped, MK Ultra, and things like, the Operation Paperclip, which is clearly what Dr. Hilarius is a direct reference to.
Yeah, and that's definitely a thing in Gravity's Rainbow too. Paperclip's the one about us bringing Nazis to the U.S., right?
Yeah.
Werner von Braun. Do we want to get into quotes we like now, or what do you all want to do?
Yeah,
or
I
references. I didn't really pick up on a lot of references in this one.
There weren't, I don't think, in this first part. But as far as
I disagree.
Quotes, no, please, yeah, I want to.
Yeah. So I mean, off the bat, we get the references to Bartók and to Muzak and Vivaldi. Yeah. We get Oedipa reading book reviews in the latest Scientific American, which is a very surface level reference, but it's an important one there. It builds her character in the sense that she is the kind of person who really she wants to be informed, but her only access is through these pre-digested book reviews from popular science. Like, this is not Scientific American is not academic. It's not teaching you actually breaking news. It's giving you pre-digested stuff that, from a conspiratorial perspective, it's what they want you to know.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And then also, and I totally forgot about this as far as references, the numerous references to like The Shadow and Jack Lemmon and those kind of pop culture icons.
One that I really liked, I think it's interesting. I don't know if he was intending this to be the way it's read. He wrote it in 1966 or something. When she recalls the call that Pierce made to her and Mucho, it is situated as, it took her till the middle of Huntley and Brinkley to remember. And Huntley and Brinkley was the competition to CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And no one nowadays knows who the hell those people are. That's
true. Most people probably don't remember who Walter Cronkite was even.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Something, and that reminded me specifically the Walter Cronkite and the news thing. I think what's integral, and I keep coming back to the California trilogy on this, but I think it's vital, especially in examining what happened in the 60s and how, what contributed to the downfall of the counterculture movement. TV plays a huge role in Vineland and in Lot 49, especially, I think, where you see that kind of the placation that people get into when they're just watching TV. They kind of zone out and it becomes what their focus is, because that was the time that TV was really becoming TV. It wasn't just your Leave It to Beaver and nightly news kind of thing. Like, shows were starting to happen and movies were getting broadcast on TV, and so that was starting to really get its hooks into a lot of people and becoming the sort of new addiction, the new psychedelic that people had that wasn't there before and that started to kind of consume them.
Yeah, and going back, I can't remember. I think both of you have mentioned this chapter talks a lot about Oedipa being discontent, and I think very subtly you can see, she has an herb garden, which at that point in time was kind of a trend of the counterculture. And it was part of the trend of the counterculture that suburbanites could get into. It was a way of feeling like you were freeing yourself from the systems around you. Again, she's reading Scientific American. She's trying to educate herself. She's making whiskey sours, which to me seems like a fairly outdated drink for the 60s. To me, that's the time of tequila. To me, that's the time of vodka.
Especially in Southern California, yeah.
Yeah. And then you have, again, Huntley and Brinkley. They were not the premier news source of that time period. All of these things situate both Oedipa and Mucho as people who feel that they are separate from the masses and yet are not at all distinct.
This is just in one chapter that we're talking, like 12 pages. Let's go ahead and talk quotes, unless anybody had any other references they wanted to bring. I don't think there was really much. I mean, math tends to play a huge role in a lot of his books, but there's not much in Lot 49 that I remember. Pop culture, music, science, that stuff definitely comes up. But I mean, as far as quotes,
Fu Manchu. That's the only other one I can think of.
I think as far as like I mentioned the description that where Mucho's recalling the trade-ins, that one hit me real hard. The other big one that I marked was when she saw the painting and or was recalling the painting rather, and that there's that whole section about being in there and describing the painting and the tapestry which spilled out the slit windows and into a void, so on and so on. But what really hit me was the kind of the end part of that description where it says, she could carry the sadness of the moment with her in that way forever, see the world refracted through those tears, those specific tears, as if indices as yet unfound varied in important ways from cry to cry.
I love that one because it's a kind of a thematic foreshadowing of his later obsession with optics.
Yeah.
And earlier in that paragraph, I particularly really loved there had hung the sense of buffering insulation. She had noticed the absence of an intensity, as if watching a movie just perceptibly out of focus that the projectionist refused to fix. And you can't tell when she feels this way, really. I mean, it's situated in about 3 different ways.
Yeah, I did. I think I wrote down like the word repression right there, which she does seem at the beginning of this book to be somewhat repressed, which then makes me think of Kafka, who a few months ago I read The Trial, and there are some similarities between Crying of Lot 49 and Kafka, I'd say. I mean, the sense of there being like a vast partially bureaucratic conspiracy that the narrator, or not, that both the narrator and the main character don't understand, like a sense of like an overwhelming network that the main character is in the middle of, and like kind of at the whim of like that network.
Yeah, and I think to draw more to The Trial in Kafka, there's a strong tendency in both of those authors, in both Pynchon and Kafka, to situate horror and comedy in the exact same space. The long paragraph about Mucho crying over the cars, and the section about Oedipa hallucinating Uncle Sam, who turns into her psychiatrist making a funny face. I mean, those are both, if you're reading the book and you're invested in the book, they're both horrifying, but they are also both entirely stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I do like the Fu Manchu thing is kind of the first time this book brings up racism and kind of racist caricatures, which later in the book there are more mentions. I guess Hilarius doing the Gestapo thing is also an example of something that has to do with racism, but that is kind of an undercurrent in this book, is racism in America and racism among the establishment in America, like systemic racism, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the whole part where Pierce is calling starts with heavy Slavic tones, looking for a bat, then comic Negro, then a hostile Pachuco dialect, and a Gestapo officer. I mean, those are all over the place, and I can sit here and try to come up with what the meaning is with that progression. I haven't come up with anything, and I don't know if anyone has.
Another quote that I wrote, and it's not so much the prose of it for me, it was just the kind of blatant foreshadowing, which isn't always common in his books, but when Oedipa is talking to Roseman, when they have their meeting, after they go to lunch and he's trying to play footsie with her, Oedipa asks, she says, "Hey," said Oedipa, "can't I get someone to do it for me?" Referring to doing the whole execution of the will. And me, said Roseman, "some of it, sure, but aren't you even interested in what? In what you might find out?" And then it kind of just drops from there, and we go into that talk of the tower and the painting and everything like that. But I thought that was just, so, opening the door for everything that's about to happen. Because she could have easily just found someone to do it for her, and then there's no story there. There's no, nothing happens. But it's kind of the push out the door for her of like, yeah, maybe you could, but what's the point? Because, who knows how far down this rabbit hole you're going to go.
Yeah, and to kind of build on that, I mean, Oedipa's life seems kind of like it lacks a central unifying theme, or like she seems to lack direction in this first chapter. Like I think she's a stay-at-home wife, not even a mom. And like she seems to be searching for a purpose kind of passively. And then this executing the will seems to be the purpose that she kind of chooses for herself.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, Thomas Pynchon gets criticized more or less rightfully for his portrayal of female characters, but I do think in this case he is almost explicitly, not explicitly, but almost explicitly pointing to the fact that so many women are essentially raised to only think of themselves in relationship to men, because those bits of character we get from Oedipa are framed as memories defined by other men, or well, by men.
Yeah.
The quote that I liked the most was, and we already kind of talked about it some, was the Uncle Sam paragraph, that "we want you," hanging in the air over her bed. She now beheld the well-known portrait of Uncle that appears in front of all of our post offices, his eyes gleaming unhealthily, his sunken yellow cheeks most violently rouged, which is such a great phrase, his finger pointing between her eyes. "I want you." I don't really know why this is, but some of my like earliest memories are being in school and seeing those that kind of poster, the Uncle Sam poster, and then like Rosie the Riveter posters, the kind of American propaganda posters.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been kind of into and obsessed with, like vaguely kind of passively obsessed with the Uncle Sam posters and stuff. The mental image it gives to me is kind of like a almost like zombified Uncle Sam, who is wearing a bunch of makeup or something. Like a almost like undead, but still like needing you to serve your country thing. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like Uncle Sam as a Lich King.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was flipping through, I found one more quote that I kind of wanted to end, I mean, at least in my quotes on. At the end of the chapter, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a bit long, but there's kind of a description, and it kind of piggybacks on what you were saying about Oedipa, as at least in this chapter, as kind of, the character development we get for her comes in terms of her relationship with men. And at the end of the chapter, after she's kind of recalling the painting and everything, there's that part that it starts with, "Such a captive maiden, having plenty of time to think, soon realizes that her tower, its height and architecture, are like her ego, only incidental. That what really keeps her there, that really keeps her where she is magic, anonymous and malignant, visited on her from outside and for no reason at all." And it goes on a little bit after that, but I thought that was kind of an interesting way to look at her, especially this early on, and how a lot of what we know of her to this point is kind of determined by the men in her life, the outside forces in her life.
Yeah, that particular line always strikes me as super enigmatic, because what is the tower? What is the tower there? Is it just her discontent? Is it her search for meaning? Is it her isolation? What is the tower?
I kind of took
Right.
it. I took it more as like her isolation, which could be self-chosen. She could get a job, be more of a part of the community, but she chooses to stay at home. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
No, that's
Well, it's
definitely part
also-
of it.
It's
Yeah.
interesting too because when she talks about in recalling what got like Pierce coming in there, I thought it was really interesting that he came in there like the way he got in there. He couldn't climb, like Rapunzel. He couldn't climb her hair and get up there. He used a credit card to Jimmy the Lock, basically. Like, he used the power of money to get in.
It's a great
And
metaphor
to get
or
to her.
simile.
Yeah.
Well, but it's not just he used the power of money. He didn't use the power of money. What he used was like a side effect of having the power of money. He jimmied the lock with a credit card. He didn't bribe the guard.
Right.
And that's an interesting comment, and I'm not sure what it means, how it connects to anything else, but it's very salient.
It's kind of, I mean, we're obviously only in the first chapter, so it's hard to say too much about how important this chapter is in terms of the plot itself. But I think it does establish a lot of very important elements that are going to come as we go through the book. And I don't want to touch too much on that because I don't want to, spoil anything for anyone who this is their first time going through it.
One thing that struck me is I think if I remember correctly, the first time I read this book, I expected Mucho to be a much bigger presence in the rest of the
did too.
book.
Definitely.
I was reading a self-published book of scholarship on Lot 49 that kind of summarized his role in Vineland, and it almost seems like he gets more play in Vineland at the end of Vineland. I think he gets more than one. He gets like 2 or 3 pages of prose pretty much devoted to him, and that's almost more than he gets in the rest of this book.
That's definitely true. He is much more important to the plot of Vineland. But at the same time, I do think that Mucho's presence in this book is very important. He does do something very specific.
He's definitely not in it, as much as you would think, given his relation to Oedipa.
I mean, he's a pretty fleshed out character, especially, I mean, Pynchon.
Oh, yeah.
Pynchon in this book, I think, does a much better job than perhaps in stuff like Gravity's Rainbow of fleshing out his characters fully. But I mean, in this first chapter, we get a lot about him. Like he's very much like a 3-dimensional character.
And then I think we kind of forgot to mention this in the beginning, but that I'm curious now if that aspect of it has anything to do with Pynchon's own view on this book. For those who don't know, and I'm sure most of the people listening are already aware of this, Pynchon is not a fan of this book. In the intro to Slow Learner, which is really like one of the only times that we're really given any information about him that we can rely on, he talks specifically
if we can rely on it.
If we can, yeah, exactly. That's true.
Yeah. I have the quote ready if you want me to read
it. Yeah,
it.
please. I don't want to misquote it.
Yeah. As is clear from the up and down shape of my learning curve, however, it was too much to expect that I'd keep on for long in this positive or professional direction. The next story I wrote was The Crying of Lot 49, which was marketed as a novel, and in which I seem to have forgotten most of what I thought I'd learned up till then.
I'm curious how both of you feel about that idea, given that I know you've both read it. What do you like? Is his assessment fair, or is he just being too harsh on himself?
Well, he calls it he implies it as kind of like a bloated short story at one point, doesn't he?
I think he calls it boilerplate. I think he just basically says like, I wrote it because I needed money at the time.
So at some point he calls it a potboiler, but in a letter to his editor, he just, while saying I need an extension to finish Gravity's Rainbow, he basically says that he has a novella that he's written that he's worked on for a long time and can't get it any shorter. It's really more of a short story with glandular issues.
Yeah, that's the quote. And I mean, sorry, Pynchon, I guess, but why not just cut the play? I mean, the play. We'll get there, and perhaps on a first read at least, the play seems somewhat random and like it could be much easier summarized. And I mean, the convoluted nature of the play is perhaps key to understanding the novel as a whole, but just what exactly the play really adds is unclear to me still.
Well, so I don't know if either of you are familiar with the Death Something podcast by Michael Judge.
Yeah, I've listened to pretty much all of it. Yeah, death is around the corner.
I've
Thank
heard
you,
of it.
yes.
I haven't listened to it.
So I've only listened to the episodes on Lot 49, but he is of the opinion, as some scholars are, that it is a coded message about the JFK assassination, and in that framework, the play is crucial.
I could see that. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to listen to that episode.
It is. He is really
That part.
interesting. I think I've listened to the ones on 49. The ones that stick out to me more are the Gravity's Rainbow episodes.
He definitely has an interesting perspective on things, and he is definitely of the opinion that Pynchon is very anti psychedelic use.
I don't agree with his assessment that it's not a worthy book in his work. I don't think it's his best by even a long shot, but it's far from his worst.
I think a big part of Pynchon's dissatisfaction with Lot 49 is the fact that it's the most commonly taught book that he wrote, and therefore is going to be a lot of people's only real thing that they read by him is going to be Lot 49. And I mean, I enjoy Lot 49. It's kind of mid tier Pynchon for me. You know, there's stuff I like less, definitely. But I could kind of, as a creative writer myself, you know, if I felt like one of my books was written, because I mean, maybe, I don't know. I mean, he could have written Lot 49 just as a way to kind of tide himself over while he was working on, you know, the much longer Gravity's Rainbow, you know. So the one thing that anyone reads by you, or that most people read by you, is what you view as like a book he wrote mostly for money. Which I think we can all agree that's not necessarily Pynchon's main motivation for writing. I think I don't know. I think that plays into it.
Yeah, and I meant to bring up when I brought up Michael Judge and Death is Around the Corner. The point is the point I had in mind was the fact that he believes that Pynchon says this kind of stuff about Lot 49 because he's afraid of people taking the political implications seriously from an institutional perspective. That at least prior to Mason and Dixon, he was worried about that.
I do remember him. I do remember him talking about how he felt like, Michael S. Judge felt like Pynchon felt like he might have been commenting somehow too directly on the Kennedy stuff, and therefore being a little bit too on the establishment's radar. Is right?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I recall.
Yeah,
and I think there's an alternate perspective from it. This is in my mind, the way I read the book, it is a very didactic novel. It is about reading. It is about how to go about reading his other works in particular.
For sure. I think.
And he doesn't like didacticism. He doesn't. That's clear from the rest of his novels.
I think, and especially when we get to the you know, the waste and the Trastero and all that kind of stuff. You know, he is so, and I think it really shows in this book more than, I mean, Gravity's Rainbow touches on it too at the end, but his view on analysis, which is ironic given what we're doing here. You know, he's very much of the opinion that we shouldn't try to overanalyze everything, or even just, you know, try to analyze most things. Like, and kind of like what we talked about in the intro episode, you know, we're not here to try to objectively say this is what this is about. But, you know, I think that part of what he's getting at with this is the idea that we should be taking things as they come to us and how they affect us, and not really worry about how the rest of the world views whatever art we're consuming or whatever media we're consuming. Like it really has to be subjective rather than objective.
Definitely.
Do we want to get into the most Pynchon part of the chapter?
For me, I already mentioned it was that, you know, that description of the trading in of the cars, that long, I don't want to call it long-winded, but that very long paragraph where he does it a lot in Gravity's Rainbow and Against the Day, where he has these almost page-length sentences of just describing minutia, and it's fascinating. I absolutely love. Like it seems like it should be the most boring part of a book, but it's just so well done. that you just cannot stop, and you don't realize that the whole thing is a single sentence.
I agree. That's probably the most Pynchonian part of the chapter, but it's come in close second. I'd say would actually be the second paragraph of the novel, where it goes from just providing context about what the letter's from, fleshing out some more information from the letter, to this montage of her going shopping and doing house duties and thinking about things, and then it just immediately switches into a flashback to a year prior with a ton of weird little pop culture references in there, full of meaning that doesn't actually add up to anything.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
What about you, Luke?
So actually, I think mostly when I was thinking about it, I thought of something from the second chapter. I think, I want to say we get the name of the. Let me look at I have the Pynchon wiki up. And I think we get the name of the law firm, which has the name like this is kind of maybe a bit of a deep cut, but it has the name and this is something I'm kind of coming up with on the fly, but it has the name Kubitschek,
Yes.
which is I guess the name of it's part of the name of a Brazilian president who was according I'm basically reading off the Pynchon wiki, who was sent into exile after a coup d'etat, which for me, like the fact that you could do this weird like smoke a bunch of weed and overanalyze just that name and be like he's mentioning like the CIA is so associated with the phrase coup d'etat, especially in the 50s and 60s, but even today, and you can do this whole smoke a bunch of weed or whatever, get really paranoid about that being this weird like reference to the CIA and the Kennedy assassination and that kind of stuff. Because I mean, there is like I'm personally of the opinion that I think there's more. I don't have any like weird solid like theories about the Kennedy assassination, but it does seem to be a matter of public record that Kennedy had pissed off the CIA pretty bad, which is of course suspicious. I don't know. I just like the fact that it's one name among four, and it's could be a pretty strong reference to the CIA and U.S. foreign policy. And I mean, there's this whole big long paragraph on the Pynchon wiki just about that one name, which I mean, that's kind of maybe a bit of a deep cut, but I just find it really interesting that Pynchon, like just in a name, can make you kind of go down a rabbit hole, where you can kind of draw a bunch of conclusions that you can become convinced of, but if you try to explain them to someone else, you're just going to sound crazy.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely. I had that happen last time I read Against the Day, and I was going through the wiki. I don't remember what it was, but something stopped me, and I started reading about it. And then, like 30 minutes later, I was like, "Oh yeah, I was reading a book."
Yeah, yeah,
and I completely agree. I think those four names are great because Kubitschek is obviously full of reference, and on the other, and McMingus is it's got a reference. I mean, Mingus as a name is famous for the jazz musician
Charles
and
Mingus.
it was famous for that back when he was writing this book, and it is, I believe, a name that does come from Scottish background. I could be very wrong about that. I should probably look it up. But it's not like a name. No one's named McMingus.
yeah. And there's also, I mean, because Pynchon, there was I asked the Pynchon subreddit about. I taught Byron the Bulb as a short story about a year ago, and somebody on the subreddit suggested the short story by Pynchon that's set in like Mingeborough or something like that. And
Yeah,
if you look up the word minge, it's like, I know this is getting a little maybe tawdry, but I guess it's a reference. It's an old slang word for vagina, and I was scared that that one of the students, I don't know, I just was scared to deal with that. I guess in a college classroom with freshmen. I don't know. I mean, because that seems to. I think that comes up. I think in V maybe that name or that place name. He does seem to.
I think you're right.
He does seem to kind
Mingeborough
of.
Mingeborough is the entropy short story, right?
Yeah, and I do think it comes up in one of the novels. I can't remember which one. I'm not 100%.
I think it is V.
I think it's, yeah.
Well, in a similar kind of sense, the name of the town they live is Kinneret among the Pines, and I don't know if y'all know what Kinneret is, but it's Bethlehem, right?
Yeah, it's the Sea of Galilee, right? Which I've
Yeah.
my mom used to live on the border of Jordan and Israel / Palestine, and I think I've been to Kinneret, which I thought was interesting that he threw that in there. I mean, the Pynchon wiki associates it with Richard Farina and makes it seem like it could be like a kind of weird like half reference to where Richard Farina was living at the time. Um, it is kind of unclear why a Bible reference would be thrown in there.
Yeah, I can talk more about that later in the book. I have
Yeah,
some
I mean maybe
related things.
California is the promised land or something, but
Could be.
I would go in more of agnostic perspective, but yeah.
I got you. Yeah, that'd be interesting.
On the exact opposite end of things, away from like digging into words, I think one of the most Pynchonian aspects of this chapter is the fact that he bridged the gap from free and direct discourse as used by Jane Austen and James Joyce into the what we now think of as postmodern style, which is that use of like long lists of things and using description that are presented as narratively neutral, but if you dig into it a little bit, it only makes sense as perceived from a central character, and that is all over the place in this chapter, and it's a part of why a lot of people struggle with the book is it's such a heavy use of that kind of conversation with the reader.
I wouldn't mind if you would expand upon that, but I don't have anything to say.
Just kind of the way that you can't tell at any point in this book, like, okay, going back to that last paragraph, it starts as things developed, she was to have all manner of revelations, and that is explicitly not from her perspective, but without any regard for anything else, it shifts to really more of an internal investigation from her perspective of herself, while still having this third person description, not just in the sense of grammar, but also in like, she doesn't view herself as Rapunzel in a tower, really. That's a strange way for people to view themselves. In a sense, she does, but she probably doesn't think of it as she let down her hair and Pierce tried to climb up and then her hair fell out. She probably doesn't think about Pierce jimmying the lock, but that's all that's still indicative of how she feels. That's really what I'm talking about.
And I think that's definitely something that he does a lot more later, especially in Gravity's Rainbow. I think that really comes into play a lot more, especially the shifting, in perspective of, like, there's so many parts in Gravity's Rainbow that shift from third person into second person, and you almost never notice it happening. It just, you kind of get a few sentences in and you're like, holy shit, this is the second person. Like, it flows so seamlessly. And he does this presentation of, like what you're talking about, where explaining how it's almost like he's explaining their subconscious, where they're not aware of, that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The how it's portrayed, but like he's showing that in a way that can be understood, this concept that a person wouldn't really have of themselves, but we can contextualize it in that sense because they're a character that we're reading about.
Yeah, I think just in general, something that Pynchon does very well is in recognizing that he's writing a book. You are reading a book. This is not some transcendent story. These characters are not archetypes. These are things that he came up with, and he wrote words about these things that he came up with, and they exist in the words on the page and nothing more. There's no pretense to anything else, despite the fact that for a story to work, there kind of has to be.
And it's kind of like, I'm thinking about that now in context of his view on the book itself as being that kind of bridge, that money generator, quote unquote. that led to Gravity's Rainbow, because a lot of that kind of stylistic, thing that he's doing in this that you're talking about, like, really comes into play way more in Gravity's Rainbow and forward. So you can kind of, it's interesting when he says he forgot everything he learned, when I think really this is him building into that, if nothing else. Like, he's really ramping up into what's going to be his most known work and what he's most known for as a writer.
Yeah, V and his early short stories are clearly incredibly influenced by the Beats, and incredibly influenced by the late modernists, and that the modernist influence continues through Gravity's Rainbow, but the Beat influence outside of some specific style choices is not there in Gravity's Rainbow.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
He does seem to have kind of left that behind in some ways, although I don't know, some of his later stuff, like, I think Inherent Vice does kind of, I would say it has some Beat Generation aspects to it. I'm struggling to think of anything specific, but maybe kind of the general kind of hopefulness, which Inherent Vice does have some of. It's also kind of not hopeful in other ways. I get what you're saying though, especially with V, where V is definitely like it's almost like some of it's almost like he's almost parodying Kerouac in some ways, which is like so intensely that way.
Well, let's go ahead and wrap all of this up. So this is, I don't know how many times I've read Lot 49. This is probably my third go through. And I enjoy it. As I said earlier, it's not my favorite, but it's definitely not my least favorite of his. But I think that this conversation especially is kind of adding a lot to how I perceive it. So I'm really excited to keep going forward and see, where we all are in our viewings and our interpretations of what happens going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, this is like my 8th reading or something of this book, and just in the last few years. So I kind of coming from a different perspective a little bit there, but yeah, I mean, this conversation, I got a lot out of it. It was interesting. You guys had some great insights I hadn't considered.
Yeah, and I do think this went pretty well.
So we'll come back to chapter 2 next week and have hopefully another great conversation on that. Again, our email is mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. If you want to share your insights, your thoughts, any questions on this chapter, please feel free to send us an email, and we'll take a look and see what we think. And until then, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you all next week.
See ya.
See ya.